At dawn, the Colosseum was already in high spirits. Its arches caught the pale light, and the dust of the previous day's slaughter still clung to the stone. Beneath the seats, merchants shouted to buyers. Their baskets with olives and watered wine stood ready for the crowd that had not yet settled. The iron gates shook as the keepers drove the half-starved beasts into their pens. Lions with ribs sticking out, elephants stamping in anger, panthers scraping the bars. The tunnel was lined with a metallic row of swords, not for practice but for daily killing. And above it all, a dull rumble rose. Tens of thousands of Romans filled their places, craving the one thing their empire had perfected, death, arranged as spectacle. The Roman arena was not only a stage for games, but a workshop of cruelty. Here the emperors displayed their might, flooding the sand to imitate naval battles, starving animals to sharpen the tension, or forcing prisoners to perform myths that ended in real executions. These were not accidents of history. They were politics woven into Rome's machine of control. The joy in the stands meant confirming the empire itself. That is why today we descend into the most savage and inhuman arenas, which went too far even for Rome. From bloody funeral customs to staged executions, we will uncover how civilization built its reputation by turning pain into applause. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to this channel. It helps us keep bringing the darkest and strangest stories from history, and guarantees you will not miss the next dive into the past. Now take your place as the gates creak and the show begins. The first gladiatorial battle in Rome did not start with fanfare, nor with emperors sweating in purple. It started with funerals. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Para chose to honor their father not with statues, poetry, or prayers, but with blood. They arranged 3 pairs of slaves, armed them, and forced them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market smelling of dung and smoke. It was not amusement. It was duty, what the Romans called munus, a debt to the dead. The ritual had roots older than Rome itself. Among warriors, captives were killed at graves to calm the spirits of the dead. With time, the sacrifice changed. The dead no longer asked for random victims, but demanded duels between chosen men. The Samnites, once fierce enemies of Rome, regularly practiced such contests, and the Roman elite borrowed the custom eagerly. To bury a man with treasure was one thing. To bury him with a spectacle of blood was another, reminding everyone of his family's strength. But funerals were only the beginning. By the 3rd century BC, Roman leaders discovered that these fights could serve more than memory. They could serve politics. Religious festivals, organized by magistrates striving for popularity, soon began to include gladiatorial contests. The people of Rome, once solemn in celebrating Jupiter, began to accept gladiators. The Senate presented this as an honor, but everyone in the crowd understood it was state-sponsored entertainment meant to keep the masses loyal. Even the arms and armor told stories. Early gladiators often dressed to look like the defeated enemies of Rome. Samnites with heavy shields and helmets, Phrygians with curved blades, Gauls with their long swords. Watching the gladiators meant reliving Rome's victories again and again. Every strike on the sand reminded citizens of the empire's domination. It was more than death, it was propaganda, and the arenas grew as fast as blood was spilled. At first, wooden stands were built for short performances. By the end of the Republic, these temporary constructions were replaced by stone amphitheaters, permanent temples of violence, where thousands could gather. Games no longer belonged to private families, they belonged to the state. Each drop of blood spilled was another reminder that Rome commanded not only people and armies, but death itself. In those early days, no Roman could imagine how far the games would evolve. What began as ritual sacrifice turned into theater, and what began as duty became obsession. Rome discovered a new form of power, control not only over life, but also over the meaning of dying. And once that door was opened, it was never closed again. The roar of the crowd was not always for gladiators. Sometimes it was for beasts dragged from the farthest corners of the known world, animals that had no place in Rome. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes from deserts appeared in the arenas. not as wonders of nature, but as victims of mass killing. The Romans called these shows venations, hunts. They were not about survival. They were about domination, proof that the empire could capture wild nature and destroy it for pleasure. Julius Caesar set the standard early. In his games in 46 BC, he showed a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. Romans called it a chameleon, half camel, half leopard, because they had no other name for it. The animal did not live long. It was thrown into the arena to be killed, not admired. Caesar's message was clear. If Rome could seize the strangest creatures alive, then Rome could conquer everything. The scale of slaughter was immense. At the opening of the Colosseum in the 80s AD, Emperor Titus is said to have killed more than 9,000 animals in one festival. Some fought each other, others were pitted against armed hunters called bestiarii. Archaeologists in Rome have uncovered animal bones marked by deliberate starvation, evidence that lions and bears were weakened before release, ensuring a bloody but one-sided fight. Even elephants, once feared by the Roman legions in Hannibal's army, were dragged into the arena and slaughtered to applause. The logistics were also part of the show. Exotic animals had to be captured, transported, and kept alive long enough to appear in the games. Caravans carried chained beasts across deserts. Fleets brought cages down the Nile. Guides risked their lives to deliver the cargo. It was one thing to meet a panther in the wild, another to see it leap from a cage before 5,000 or 10,000 cheering Romans. Each animal was a living trophy of the empire, proof of how far Rome's reach extended. Some emperors made the hunts into vanity projects. Commodus, never modest, performed in the arena dressed as Heracles and slaughtered hundreds of animals himself. Supposedly a god among beasts, in reality, just an insecure man with a bow. He even staged hunts where the animals were tied or crippled, guaranteeing his easy triumph. The audience still applauded, not from admiration, but from fear. When the emperor hunts, you clap. But behind the noise lay a quieter tragedy. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder noted that rare animals began to vanish from certain regions after decades of Roman hunts. Ecological destruction was the hidden price of entertainment. Species that once roamed freely in North Africa were driven to extinction to satisfy Roman bloodlust. The Colosseum was not only a theater of death, but also a machine of ecological ruin. For the Romans, extinction did not matter. What mattered was the illusion of control. In a world where nature seemed vast and unpredictable, the arena reduced it to a game. Capture, cage, starve, and kill. Every beast that collapsed on the sand was not only a victim, it became another stone in the foundation of Rome's power. The word gladiator may suggest equally matched fighters, skilled duelists meeting with honor before roaring crowds. But the truth was far stranger and far more cruel. The Romans did not want balanced contests. They designed uneven fights, invented unusual weapons, and created bizarre rules, all to push the spectacle of blood into new directions. Many gladiators were not given any chance for fairness. Prisoners and condemned criminals were sometimes dressed in ridiculous costumes, armed with wooden swords, and thrown against trained professionals. The audience laughed at their fear, mocking as the lopsided fights ended in quick, humiliating deaths. What seemed like sport was often nothing more than a public execution, hidden beneath a thin curtain of entertainment. The weapons themselves became characters. Retiarii, for instance, fought with a net and a trident, like fishermen. Their opponents, the secutors, carried short swords and smooth helmets designed to deflect the net. These matches were less about skill and more about suspense. Would the net catch or the blade cut through? Romans loved this tension, even when the fights looked more like theater than true competition. They also experimented with numbers. Some games placed one man against several opponents. Others staged whole groups, arranged like miniature armies fighting wars for the crowd's amusement. At times, hundreds of men clashed at once, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood, shattered shields, and broken bodies. The greater the chaos, the more excited the people became. There were also gladiators who broke all patterns. Women fighters, the gladiatrices, appeared in the 1st century AD, often presented as exotic novelties. Writers like Juvenal mocked them, yet evidence shows they fought with real weapons, sometimes against dwarves, sometimes animals, sometimes each other. Their presence blurred gender roles but reinforced the idea that no man or woman was outside Rome's hunger for spectacle. Even helmets were tools of cruelty. Some were made to restrict sight or sound, forcing fighters to stumble nearly blind while the crowd laughed. Others were so heavy that raising the head was itself a struggle. Armor was not only protection. It was an obstacle, another part of the stage created to amuse the spectators. There were also battles that Rome had already won. Gladiators were dressed as barbarians, forced to fight in foreign armor, representing conquered peoples. When they fell, as they almost always did, the result reminded the audience that Rome always triumphed. These contests were propaganda with blades. Nothing was accidental. Every variation, unfair fights, odd weapons, gendered shows, served the same aim: to keep the crowds eager, astonished, and obedient. The Colosseum was never satisfied with repetition. It invented cruelty, searching for fresh ways to turn human lives into entertainment. And for the Romans, this endless creativity in bloodshed was part of the charm. By midday, when the morning gladiatorial duels ended and the crowd grew restless, the arena changed pace. What followed was no longer a contest, but a theater of death. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. For the condemned, it was not a trial but a script they were forced to perform. The victims came from Rome's edges: criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war. Their crimes were translated into punishments meant to match their supposed sins. Thieves might be torn apart by wolves, instigators burned alive, traitors ripped to pieces by lions. Each execution was a moral drama written in blood. The scale could be immense. Under Emperor Trajan, during his Dacian Wars, thousands of prisoners were executed in just 123 days. These killings were not random slaughter. These executions were not random but carefully staged, stretched out like scenes in a grim play. Every death was arranged to hold the crowd's attention until the next spectacle appeared. Animals stood at the center of the performance. Lions were starved nearly to madness before release. Bears were chained in pits and tormented until they collapsed. Even leopards, considered exotic treasures, were thrown out as helpless victims. The unpredictability of the beasts made each death grotesquely tense. Would the lion kill at once, or toy with its prey while the audience roared? At times cruelty was dressed in myth. Prisoners were forced to act out characters from tragedies. Orpheus torn apart by wild animals. Prometheus chained while vultures circled overhead. The mix of legend and punishment turned executions into grotesque parodies of theater. For Rome, it was never enough that the condemned should simply die. They had to die symbolically, embodying Roman myths with their own bodies. Cruelty reached beyond animals. Crucifixion, a penalty Rome had borrowed from the East, was often carried out in the arena. Men and women were nailed to wooden crosses. Their slow agony unfolded while merchants sold wine and children played in the stands. Fire, too, had its place. Tunics soaked in pitch or resin were strapped to victims and set ablaze, making what Tertullian bitterly described as living torches. These executions were more than bloody shows. They were propaganda. By punishing in public, the state reminded everyone of its absolute power. Resistance was not only useless, it was fatal, and the audience witnessed the warning. Each body on the sand was a message written in flesh. This is the fate of those who defy Rome. Not all rejoiced. Philosophers like Seneca condemned the cruelty, saying that such spectacles left men more brutal than before, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of thousands who came not for justice but for entertainment. In Rome's theater, death was perfected into a lesson, and every cry from the arena reminded the living who truly held power. The empire was not content with battles on sand. Sometimes emperors demanded oceans within their city. Naumachii, mock naval battles, became spectacles of absurd scale, where water itself was turned into a weapon of cruelty. Unlike gladiatorial contests, these were not duels of champions. They were slaughterhouses disguised as naval drama. Julius Caesar staged the first great naval battle in 46 BC. He ordered a vast basin dug near the Tiber, filled it with water, and launched real ships. Thousands of prisoners were forced aboard, told to fight like enemy fleets. They were no actors but condemned men with no chance of survival. The ships bore catapults, archers, and marines armed with steel. The result was not theater but an artificial war, fought for applause alone. Augustus, Caesar's heir, carried the madness further. In 2 BC, he created a basin nearly 2,000 by 1,200 Roman feet, supplied by a special aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, just to fill it. 30 warships clashed on its waters, each crowded with men already sentenced to death. The scale itself delivered the message. Rome could rule seas even where none existed, turning nature into a prop of political theater. Even natural landscapes were not safe. In AD 52, Emperor Claudius drained Lake Fucine and used its waters for a naval spectacle. The convicts saluted him with the words that echoed through history, Morituri te salutant. Those who are about to die salute you. Whether spontaneous or staged, the phrase captured the fatalism of those forced to die for sport. Fire again returned to the arena. A prisoner was dressed in a tunic soaked in resin, then set aflame. The victims became living torches, burning until they collapsed. Sometimes these fiery deaths were cast into myths. Hercules dying in his poisoned shirt, or Mucius Scaevola proving loyalty by burning his own hand. The crowd did not see mere executions. They watched a theater written in screams and smoke. The Colosseum itself could even be flooded. Ancient sources say that under Titus and later Domitian, the arena floor was rebuilt to hold small pools for sea shows. Engineers created drains and channels that turned the sand into water, letting miniature fleets fight before the ground was dried again for gladiator games the next day. Even in architecture, Rome shaped cruelty as if it were just another performance. What linked water and fire was control. To summon the ocean inside the city or to turn human beings into burning torches was to prove domination, both over nature and over people. The emperors were not only rulers of citizens. They claimed to command the elements. By burning or drowning their prisoners, they created the illusion that Rome itself was divine, powerful over earth, sea, and flame. By the end of the 1st century AD, executions were no longer just punishments. They became staged scripts filled with twisted invention, where Roman mythology served as a guide for torture. The condemned were forced to act out well-known legends, ending with real and bloody deaths. One of the first examples happened at the opening games of the Colosseum in AD 80. The poet Martial described a performer acting as Orpheus, the musician who charmed animals with his lyre. In the myth, the beasts sit quietly in awe. In the arena, it ended otherwise. The man played his instrument, but instead of enchantment, a bear was released and tore him apart before the crowd. Rome twisted beauty into a dark parody. Another victim played Daedalus, the inventor who escaped on wings. In the Colosseum, the prisoner entered on a rough device meant to copy flight. The machine collapsed, as planned, and he fell to the beasts waiting below. Martial joked that the man likely wished for real feathers, proof that even Roman poets mocked human pain. Perhaps most disturbing was the show of Pasiphae, the queen cursed to desire a bull. In one performance, a woman, or perhaps a disguised man, was tied to a contraption that imitated her union with the beast. Afterwards, she was killed, mixing execution with humiliation and pornography. A myth that once warned against pride became live disgrace for entertainment. Fire also played its role. Prisoners in resin-soaked tunics acted as heroes who met fire trials. Hercules dying in his poisoned shirt, or Mucius Scaevola burning his hand to prove loyalty. They screamed, but the audience laughed, knowing these were not heroes but criminals dressed in myths. The theater of cruelty relied on this reversal. Gods and legends reduced to ashes before the people. This stage of torture deepened Rome's obsession with control. By retelling myths with living victims, the state not only killed but rewrote history. Cultural symbols of strength, sacrifice, and defiance were turned into mocking tools. Each myth performed in the arena became propaganda, reminding that only Rome gave legends their meaning. For the audience, it was amusement between battles. For the condemned, it was painful deaths in costume. For Rome, it was political theater proving that even mythology could be used as a weapon against the weak. In the Colosseum, myths were not spoken or painted. They were carved into flesh, burned into bones, and met with applause until silence fell over the sand. If the arena reflected Rome's thirst for blood, the emperors made it a mirror of their vanity. Some rulers used the games as political weapons, others as private shows. The line between control and possession blurred, until the emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and in what way. Caligula, remembered for eccentric cruelty, once ordered spectators dragged into the arena when no animals remained. They had come to watch executions, but became victims themselves. For him, the line between audience and prey was thin as paper, and crossing it was part of the thrill. Nero, obsessed with his image as an artist, preferred the sand as a stage. Yet he too used the arena as a canvas of cruelty, staging complex shows where theater mixed with punishment. Prisoners were dressed as tragic roles and killed in ways that fit the characters. Nero called it art. His critics called it madness. And then came Commodus, perhaps Rome's most infamous emperor showman. He not only sponsored the games, he performed in them. Wearing the costume of Heracles, he entered the arena with club and bow. He killed hundreds of animals, often crippled beforehand to guarantee his victory. He even drew money from the city treasury to fund his performances, draining the state while bathing in applause forced from a terrified audience. Commodus did not stop with animals. He fought gladiators as well, but always under conditions that guaranteed his survival. Defeat was impossible, applause was mandatory. Domitian, meanwhile, turned the arena into an extension of his paranoia. He staged hunts and executions with particular delight, sometimes at night under torchlight, making the shows unpredictable. He kept the people in constant unease, never certain when entertainment might become terror. For him, control itself was the grand performance. Even emperors who were more restrained could not escape the law of spectacle. Trajan, often celebrated as one of Rome's good emperors, marked his Dacian victories with 123 days of games. The festivals included thousands of gladiatorial combats and executions, a reminder that even rulers considered benevolent measured glory in blood. The obsessions of emperors revealed more than personal quirks. The arena became the place where rulers tested their public image. Sponsoring lavish hunts displayed wealth. Killing with their own hands signified divine power. Burning prisoners as living torches showed that their authority extended not only over armies, but over the very meaning of human dignity. But possession carried a cost. Emperors who indulged too much in spectacle often lost the respect of the Senate, the treasury, or the people themselves. Both Caligula and Commodus met violent ends, remembered not for governance but for theatrical bloodshed. The arena that once glorified their reign exposed their madness. For Roman emperors, cruelty was not merely a policy, it was an ideology. And in the Colosseum, the most perilous role was not the gladiators, but the emperors, believing himself untouchable. Not everyone rejoiced when the gates opened. For some Romans, the arena was not a triumph of civilization but a symptom of its decay. Philosophers, poets, and early Christians left behind words that revealed a quieter Rome, one that saw decline rather than glory on the sand. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, admitted openly that the games disturbed him. After witnessing one execution, he wrote that he left more cruel and less human than when he entered. To him, the arena did not cleanse the soul. It corrupted it, teaching citizens to treat suffering as amusement. His words revealed the darker consequence of spectacle. Violence did not stay within the amphitheater. It seeped into Roman life. Cicero, decades earlier, hinted at the same unease. Though he praised courage in battle, he condemned cruelty for its own sake. Yet even he acknowledged the political necessity of games, admitting that the masses demanded them as proof of a magistrate's generosity. His dilemma exposed the Roman paradox. To be moral was to seem weak, but to rule meant feeding the crowd's hunger for blood. Early Christians viewed the arena as both persecution and testimony of faith. Men and women who refused to renounce their beliefs were thrown to beasts or burned alive. Their deaths turned into public amusement. Writers like Tertullian denounced the games as demonic, calling them altars of cruelty. For Christians, each cheer from the stands was proof that the empire itself was built on injustice. Critics were not wrong about the cost. The endless games drained the treasury. By the later empire, rulers bankrupted themselves to stage ever more spectacular shows, competing with the glory of their predecessors. What had once stood as a symbol of strength became a mark of desperation, a tool to buy loyalty to the empire and a struggle for survival. The cultural obsession with spectacle weakened the Roman spirit. Citizens who had once honored military discipline now demanded cheap bread and endless games. The satirist Juvenal mocked this dependency with his phrase, "bread and circuses." For him, the crowd's hunger for amusement revealed how far Rome had strayed from its republican roots. The decline of the spectacles mirrored the decline of the empire itself. As resources drained and frontiers collapsed, the ability to stage vast performances diminished. Amphitheaters crumbled, and the roar of lions gave way to silence and neglect. By the 5th century, when barbarian invasions shattered the heart of the empire, the Colosseum remained standing, still imposing, but emptied of its bloody voice. Yet the moral questions never faded. Could a society that normalized cruelty truly endure it? Philosophers believed it could not. Looking back, the games appeared less as a triumph of Roman might than as a warning of how quickly human dignity could be traded for applause. The Colosseum still rises, its arches battered by wind, its seats long abandoned, yet the ghosts of the arena linger. Walk through its tunnels today, and you can almost hear the echo. The clash of iron, the roar of beasts, the cries of 50,000 voices rising together. It is easy to admire the architecture, the grandeur, the scale of the structure. Harder but more honest is to remember why it was built. Cruelty, rehearsed and repeated, until it became ordinary. The Roman arenas were never only about blood. They were about control. By turning death into entertainment, the empire taught its citizens to see pain as spectacle, to reward obedience, and to laugh at despair. Every execution, every hunt, every myth carried the same message. The power of Rome was without limit. In truth, the games were not about the victims at all. They were about the spectators, and about the empire's ability to shape what those spectators thought and felt. And that is the lasting lesson. The Colosseum reminds us not only of Rome's brilliance, but also of its blindness. A society that exalted violence eventually collapsed under its own weight, leaving ruins that tell a story both inspiring and foreboding. So what about you? Which of these spectacles, the animal hunts, the burning myths, or the emperor's madness, strikes you the most?